Picture the caveman's dinner. You already have the image. A man crouched by a fire, tearing into a dripping slab of red meat with his bare hands. It's on the cover of the diet books, it's in the museum diorama, it's the whole idea of what our ancestors ate. Big game, raw muscle, meat, and more meat. That picture is almost completely wrong. And the real menu, the actual food that kept human beings alive for hundreds of thousands of years, would horrify half the people walking down the supplement aisle right now. Because to answer what ancient humans ate, we first have to deal with the problem. The evidence has been lying to us for 100 years. Here's the problem. When an ancient human killed an animal, the bones survived. The butchery marks on those bones survived. The stone spear points and cutting blades survived. All of it sits in the ground for 100,000 years waiting to be dug up. But when an ancient human ate a handful of berries, or dug up a root, or boiled a pile of greens, none of that survived. Plants rot. They're gone in a season. They leave almost nothing behind. So for most of the history of archaeology, we dug up the meat and missed everything else. We found the bones and the blades, and we built a caveman in their image, a hunter, a carnivore, a man who basically ate steak. It was never the truth, it was just the only part of the meal tough enough to fossilize. And then fairly recently, we learned how to see the rest of the plate. The breakthrough came from something disgusting, dental calculus. That's the hardened plaque, the tartar that builds up on teeth. It turns out that as it hardens, it traps microscopic bits of whatever a person was eating, and then it fossilizes right there on the tooth and survives for tens of thousands of years. Scrape it off, put it under a microscope, and you can find the actual food, starch grains, and plant fibers locked in the mouths of the dead. And when scientists started doing this, the all-meat caveman fell apart. Take Border Cave in the mountains on the border of South Africa and Eswatini. In 2020, researcher Lynn Wadley and her team published a discovery in the journal Science. In the ancient hearts of that cave, they found dozens of small charred cylinders. They turned out to be rhizomes, the starchy underground stems of a plant roasted in the ashes of the fire. Those cooked roots were up to 170,000 years old. It's the oldest direct evidence we have of humans cooking a starchy plant food. And it tells you that 170,000 years ago, people were digging roots out of the hillside with sticks, carrying them home, roasting them in the fire, and sharing them around the camp. Vegetables, at the very dawn of our species. But here's the part that really breaks the stereotype. It wasn't just us, it was the Neanderthals too. Neanderthals are supposed to be the ultimate carnivores, the big game hunters of Ice Age Europe, and then researchers led by Karen Hardy scraped the tartar off the teeth of Neanderthals from a Spanish cave called El Cedron. Inside it, they found cooked starchy plants, nuts, grasses, traces of green vegetables, and stranger still, they found yarrow and chamomile, bitter plants with almost no calories, the kind of plants you don't eat to fill your stomach, you eat them as medicine. These supposed brute carnivores were not only eating their vegetables, they appear to have been using herbal remedies. The all-meat caveman was a fantasy at every level. So plants weren't a side dish. For a lot of ancient humans, they were the foundation, and the most important plants of all were probably the ones we think about least. Roots, tubers, the boring lumps of starch growing underground. There's a reason roots and tubers are reliable. They don't fly away like an animal or vanish out of season like fruit. They sit in the ground, packed with calories, waiting to be dug up almost any time of year. For a hungry family, a hillside full of roots was a far safer bet than chasing a deer that might get away. And almost none of it would have been edible without fire. Raw roots and tubers are often fibrous, bitter, sometimes even mildly toxic, and a human gut can barely break them down. Cooking changes all of it. It softens the fibers, neutralizes the poisons, and unlocks calories that raw food simply refuses to give up. Many researchers argue that cooking is the single hinge the entire human diet swings on. The fire didn't just keep people warm at night, it quietly turned a whole world of inedible plants into food. And from those wild plants came something you'd swear was modern. Bread. At a site called Shubaika 1 in the Black Desert of northeastern Jordan, archaeologist Amaya Aarons Otayagi and her team found charred crumbs in two ancient fireplaces. They analyzed them and confirmed it. Bread. Flat, crude, made from wild grains and ground tubers, and it was 14,400 years old. Sit with that number. That bread was baked at least 4,000 years before anyone planted a single crop. People were grinding wild seeds into flour and baking it long before farming existed. We didn't invent bread because we invented agriculture. We were already making it by hand as hunter-gatherers. And it wasn't only the land, it was the sea. At Pinnacle Point on the coast of South Africa, Curtis Marian's team found a cave where humans had been eating shellfish 164,000 years ago, prying mussels and other shellfish off the rocks at low tide. There was even a barnacle that only grows on whale skin, which means at some point they'd hauled in a piece of beached whale and eaten the blubber. This was during a brutal cold, dry stretch when much of Africa had turned to desert and people had walked down to the shore and figured out that the ocean was a pantry. Once you start looking, the real ancient diet expands in every direction. Eggs robbed from nests, insects and grubs rich in fat and protein. Honey raided from wild hives, the single most prized sugar in the ancient world. And from any animal they did kill, they took everything, not just the muscle. The marrow cracked out of the bones, the fat, the organs, the brain. In some places, they even ate the contents of an animal's stomach for the half-digested plants inside. Nothing was wasted because nothing could be. The menu was ruled by one principle only. If it had calories and it wouldn't kill you, it was dinner. Now let's not overcorrect. Meat was real, and it mattered enormously. In cold climates where plants disappeared for half the year, some groups lived almost entirely on animals, and the chemistry locked in their bones proves it. But here's a detail that surprises people. A human being cannot survive on lean meat alone. Eat nothing but pure, lean protein for long enough, and your body actually begins to break down, a real and dangerous condition that hunters have described for centuries. So the fat was the true prize, not the muscle. The marrow, the brain, the organs, the greasy layer under the skin. In hard times, foragers would sometimes discard the lean meat entirely and keep the fat because the fat was the part that kept you alive. The point was never that ancient humans were vegetarians. The point is the opposite. There was no single ancient diet at all. This is the thing the caveman myth gets most wrong. A forager in the Arctic and a forager in the tropics ate almost opposite meals. One lived on seal fat and fish and could go months without seeing anything green. The other lived on roots and fruit and seeds and might rarely bring down large game at all. Same species, same era, completely different plates. The paleo diet, as a single fixed menu, is a modern marketing invention. It never existed. There were thousands of paleo diets, and the only rule that connected them was brutally simple. Eat what's here, eat what's in season, or starve. Which brings us to the real answer to our question, and the part almost nobody talks about. The biggest change in the history of human eating was not a food, it was a narrowing. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans ate an enormous range of wild species. Hundreds of different plants and animals across a single year. Roots in one season, fruit in another, shellfish on the coast, game when they could get it, greens and seeds and nuts and eggs and honey in between. Their diet was wide and wild and constantly changing. Then, around 10 to 12,000 years ago, came agriculture. And agriculture is the story of trading that enormous variety for a tiny handful of reliable crops. Wheat, barley, rice. Suddenly, most of human food was coming from 2 or 3 grasses. And our bodies recorded the bill. When you look at human skeletons, from the moment farming takes over, the changes are stark. Cavities, which were rare before, suddenly fill people's mouths because the diet flooded with starchy grain. Average height drops, signs of nutritional deficiency, of anemia and stunted growth show up in the bones. We got more food. We got more reliable food. And in exchange for a long time, we got worse food. So picture that caveman again, the one tearing into a slab of red meat on the cover of the diet book. The truth is, he barely existed. The real ancient human was someone who could name 300 plants, who knew which root was ready this week and which berry would stop your heart, who dug tubers with a stick, ground wild seeds into flour, cracked bones for the marrow, pulled shellfish off the rocks, and robbed the bees for honey. Someone whose diet was wilder, broader, and more varied than almost anything you could buy today. We didn't inherit their menu. We inherited the narrowing that came after it. Which means the strangest part of this whole story is the part you already know from the inside. Out of every human who has ever lived, the one eating the smallest, narrowest, most repetitive slice of what the planet has to offer is probably you.